Hello, in this video I'm going to be tier listing all of the specs in the game in Mythic Plus and Dragonflight. This is all based on beta, it's all subject to change, and we can make fun of me in a few weeks when all of my predictions are inevitably very wrong. But if you just want a very brief overview of how I think your class is doing in Mythic Plus, let's get into it. So first on the list, we're just going to go in order. We're going to do the 3 Death Knights. So first we have Blood Death Knight. So Blood Death Knight in the end of Shadowlands was incredibly powerful in Mythic Plus. They were dealing 1,000,000,000 damage and were basically completely unkillable. They are maintaining a lot of that build with Rune Weapon uptime, but it's nerfed quite a bit compared to what it was in Shadowlands. I'm going to put them in very strong. I don't think they'll quite be Flavor of the Month. I think they're lacking a little bit of damage, but they are going to be very unkillable and generally quite strong. I just think they'll fall a little bit behind in damage compared to some other tanks, but they are very good and will be able to push quite high keys. Next up, we have Frost Death Knight. Frost Death Knight is kind of weird. So if you're pulling very, very optimally, I think they are quite good because they can maintain a lot of breath uptime. But I really think they're too reliant on breath uptime to be good in Mythic Plus, especially for the average player. If you're not incredibly heavy at chain pulling, they just lose a lot of damage. They don't have enough cooldown reduction to get their breath up often, so I'm going to put them into average. Next on the list, we have Unholy Death Knight. Unholy Death Knight has a absolute absorbent amount of cooldowns, but they have generally fairly long cooldowns overall. I think the way Unholy Death Knight's going to play around popping wounds and ramping from popping wounds, they're going to be dealing quite a lot of consistent damage, and they just have so many cooldowns in their kit that I think they'll usually have something available. So I think on average, they'll probably be doing better than Frost Knight in Mythic Plus, although I could very easily be wrong about this. I think both these specs will be fairly good. Probably not Flavor of the Month level, but I think they'll both be very strong. Alright, so next on the list we have Havoc Demon Hunter. Havoc Demon Hunter is actually very, very strong in keys right now. I think they're very close to Fodom tier. I'll have to think about it later on as I get more specs. They're minimum very strong, if not Fodom. They just have an absolute boatload of damage right now. They have all of their great cooldowns from Shadowlands coming back. No more Sinful Brand Cringe playstyle. They're just absolutely pumping out damage. Their burst AoE is insane. I think they're going to be very strong. Then we have Vengeance Demon Hunter. Vengeance Demon Hunter, I think, is just very, very tanky. They have a ton of damage coming in. They just have access to 1,000,000 different really great cooldowns. I think Vengeance Demon Hunter has a very high chance of being Fodom tier. I think they could also be very strong. It really depends. For this list, I'm going to put them in Fodom because I really think on top of having a ton of damage as a tank and also being very tanky, they have the Chaos Brand to push them over the edge, giving that 5% magic damage, which is one of the best raid buffs to have in Mythic Plus. So if all tanks are even, usually Vengeance Demon Hunter pulls slightly ahead. And so for that reason, I'm going to put them in Fodom. But the tanks are all, there's several tanks that are extremely strong. I really think it could be a close competition. Next up, we get to the Druid specs. First on the list, we have Balanced Druid. I think Balanced Druid has a lot of good utility for Mythic Plus, but I think they're kind of hurt by the fact that the way Starfall works now, it makes them way too good at spread AoE. And so to be balanced in raid, they kind of have to tone down the AoE quite a bit. And I think that's really going to hurt Balanced Druid. In addition to that, they have some really great utility in the form of trees and solar beam. But trees really loses all of its value if tanks are strong enough to live without it. So that kind of ruins that ability. I think Balanced Druid will be good. I think their kit scales extremely well with stats now, and their AoE damage has very high potential. I just don't think they're going to quite make it into the very strong or Fodom tier. Unless something massive changes about tuning, they're just not quite there. Next, we have Feral Druid. Feral Druid actually is doing very well. Their single target damage is absolutely absurd. For Tyrannical weeks, Feral Druid's going to completely pump. In Fortified weeks, they're really not too bad either. Their AoE is quite good. I think they're not in. They could very easily end up in very strong tier. I don't think they have any chance of being Fodom just because the way their kit works, but they're definitely not weak at all. I'm going to put them in average. I think possibly even above Balanced Druid. I'm not ordering the tiers. I'm just leaving them as is, but Feral Druid is looking very good. Next, we have Bear. So a week ago, I would have put Bear into weak or oh god, why? But there was a recent change on Wowhead. They got a flat 50% damage buff to every single button in their kit. And I think that brings them all the way up from oh god, why to at least average, if not very strong. Because I have not seen anyone really play with it much, I'm just going to leave them in average for now. But I think Bear definitely has a chance to climb the ladder, especially with that recent 50% damage buff to every ability in their kit. That's absolutely absurd. They're definitely going to be quite strong. Last but not least, we have Restoration Druid. Restoration Druid is actually very, very powerful right now. So they have a lot of damage coming into their kit. The talent that replaced on the bottom left of their tree gives them a ton of damage through their Moonfires. In addition to that, they have Nature's Vigil to deal a bunch of damage while they're blasting on HPS. I think Restoration Druid, on top of being super mobile and able to do mechanics, has great externals with Ironbark. They have great healing. They have great damage output right now. I think they have a really good chance of being the Mythic Plus healer, so I'm putting them in the bottom tier. Next on the list, we have the DPS class of Evoker. At the moment, the class is doing fairly good damage. The spec has decent utility. They have a good knockback. They have some stuff going for them. They have fairly decent defensives. I don't think they're doing anything particularly special in terms of AoE damage. I think they're kind of right in the middle of the pack. So I'm going to put this Evoker spec in average. This is the DPS Evoker spec. Now we have the Healing Evoker spec. The Healing Evoker spec, on the other hand, is a very different story. So they have the one really big weakness of being a 30-yard class as a healer. As a DPS, it's really not as important. You can just stand closer to melee and it's fine. As a healer, it can be a problem on fights where you have to spread, especially like the last boss of Ruby Life Pools. It could be kind of hectic on there. But I really think Preservation Evoker does enough healing and enough group healing that they are going to be able to survive the highest keys if you're a great player and your team works around you. That's kind of a key part. If your team works around you, you very much have to position around your Evoker player. But if you're able to pull that off, you're rewarded with the current highest damage the current highest damage healer spec in the game. And I think Preservation Evoker has a really good chance of going into the bottom tier along with Resto Druid. I think Preservation Evoker is very likely to be one of the best healers in the game. Moving past that, we get to the Hunter specs. So Beast Mastery Hunter right now is absolutely blasting on single target and AoE. I think they're right up in the very strong. Hunters in general got quite a few more defenses in Dragonflight compared to Shadowlands, so they shouldn't be getting one-shot as much in keys. And I also think BM Hunter right now, it could just be that they're overtuned and could get nerfed, but if they don't get nerfed and they manage to dodge that hammer, man, BM Hunter is going to be slamming. I don't think they quite edge into the bottom tier. There's a few better specs coming later, but they're definitely very, very strong. Next up, we have Survival Hunter. At the end of Shadowlands, one of the best specs in the game. Unfortunately, Survival Hunter kind of lost their absolute bomb spam. They have really good execute damage with Kill Shot now, and that does reset their bombs. So once the packs are getting low, you can kind of repeat the gameplay where you're just chucking bombs every other global, but it's really just not quite at the power levels it was at the end of Shadowlands. I'm going to put them in average. I think they still have really strong AoE damage, especially in larger pulls with the way bombs work, but just nothing crazy. Then we have Marksmanship Hunter. Marksmanship Hunter is it's a little undertuned. They need some help. Marksmanship Hunter is probably one of the weakest specs in the game right now. They just really aren't doing a lot of damage. They've gotten some buffs recently, but I really just don't think it's enough to push them over the edge. Just because their damage profile is basically a shitload of 5-target cleave, and that damage profile tends to happen a lot in Mythic Plus, it keeps them out of the Oh God Y tier. They'll deal some respectable damage, but if you're a Marksmanship Hunter main, I'm sorry, this season's not looking too hot for you. All right, moving away from Hunter, we're getting into Mage here. So Mage is kind of a blessed class, of course, the true hero class of World of Warcraft. Everyone knows everyone needs to play a Mage, the only real spec. Fire Mage is back to the BFA style, where you don't Flame Strike at all. All of your damage purely comes from Ignite, which spreads on Fire Blast. And they're doing quite strong right now. They're a little overshadowed by Frost Mage, who's doing a little bit more in keys, but I really think Fire Mage is very, very strong. And like I said before, Frost Mage currently a little bit better than Fire Mage. They just have a little bit more sustained damage. It's pretty easy to keep Icy Veins up almost the entire dungeon, and because of that, they're just dealing a bit more than Fire Mage. But they're both very, very strong. They're both putting out very respectable numbers. They, of course, have the absurd mobility that mages provide. They have 2 invisibilities now, as well as a cheat death on Fire Mage. Very tanky spec, very mobile spec, just very, very dumb. Next up, we have Arcane Mage. Arcane Mage is doing fairly well in Raid Knight now. They're doing very good single target, but their cleave damage is just kind of falling off a cliff, especially compared to the other 2 Mage specs. I think you could argue to put them in average tier, but I really just don't think they're doing enough damage to be warranted in there. I'm going to put them into weak. Next up, we have Discipline Priest. So Discipline Priest, historically, is a very hard healer to play in Mythic Plus. Just the way their healing profile is with giant ramps every minute 30 does not work out well in a key where bosses do mechanics every 5 seconds. They did get a flat 30% damage buff recently to everything they do in Mythic Plus, which is pretty good, but it's not really enough to make them a meta healer in any way. They're dealing very solid damage, and they do have access to PI, and they also have access to the Twin Priestess Legendary, so they have double PI even, but I still think they're in weak. It's going to be harder to survive on a key with a Disc Priest healing you than any other healer in the game. Next up, we have Holy Priest. Like I said before, access to PI can be extremely powerful. It really helps their damage out quite a bit. In addition to that, Holy Priest is just kind of dealing a lot of damage by itself, and they have fairly solid healing. Their profiles doesn't have any issues like Disc Priest does, so they're definitely a lot better than Discipline Priest in Mythic Plus. I would even put them into very strong tier just because they deal solid damage by themselves, and the addition of PI pushes them over the edge. But they're still falling behind Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker, so I'm keeping them out of the Blessed Fodom tier. Next, we have Shadow Priest. Contrary to popular belief, Shadow Priest, they did kind of get a weird half rework, which I think is really hurting them in Raid. I think they're decent single target damage, but their stacked cleave damage is actually fairly good. I don't think they're in the very strong tier, but I think it keeps them out of weak. I would put them into average probably. They don't really have a ton of utility as far as CCs go, but they have a lot of off healing. So if that's something your group needs, Shadow Priest is very, very strong for that. And I think that can help people a lot when they're pugging keys, as Shadow Priest can basically become your healer for half the dungeon. But outside of that, I mean, they just don't have anything putting them over the edge to put them into a higher tier. Next up, we have the Rogue specs. Assassination Rogue, from my understanding, is a pure single target spec. I've really not tested anything except for Outlaw Rogue myself, to be completely honest. Outlaw Rogue just outshines the other two specs by so much. From what I've heard, Assassination Rogue is doing okay. It's nothing special. They're just doing decent. Nothing crazy to write home about. Not a terrible spec, not great. It's kind of just in middle of the pack. Next, we have Outlaw Rogue. Outlaw Rogue is when we're getting to the DPS specs that are really, really blasting. Outlaw Rogue is dealing infinite damage right now. They're sustaining like 80, 90 key DPS on every single pull and 50k on boss fights. They are just completely destroying keys. They have Shroud. They have 4 different stuns. They are just blasting everything. All the utility you could ever want and all the damage you could ever want. Outlaw Rogue is absolutely going into bottom tier. Next, we have Subtlety Rogue. Subtlety Rogue, from what I understand, is kind of just a little down bad right now. I don't know if they really deserve the Oh God Y tier, but just because they're so overshadowed by Outlaw Rogue, I'm going to put them down here. They did get some recent buffs, so it's possible they're coming out of this tier now, but I haven't got a chance to play with the buffs yet, and man, they were not feeling good before that. Next up, we have Elemental Shaman. Elemental Shaman is another case of it's just a little undertuned right now. They're just not dealing insane damage compared to other specs. And Shaman in general kind of suffers from the fact that they don't really have a ton of great utility for Mythic Plus. They have Cap Totem, which is a decent AoE stun, and they have a knockback, and they have a single target stun, but it's really just not enough. It's like okay utility. It's not fantastic. I'm going to put them into weak. They have decent damage right now, but it's not enough to carry them into being strong. Next up, we have Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman could potentially be good. It kind of relies on Wind Fury Totem. If Wind Fury Totem is pushing your other DPS over the edge, Enhancement Shaman, which is doing very solid throughput for itself right now, could end up in a higher tier. But I think they're going to be permanently hamstringed by the fact that they're a absolute single target blaster spec. And so to tune around that, Blizzard tends to nerf their AoE quite a bit because they're the same spells that deal damage to single target deal damage in AoE with the way that Crash the Lightning works. So I think Enhancement Shaman's kind of doomed to always be in the average or below tier in Mythic Plus. That being said, the way you can play with Doom Winds and get Ascendance procs every minute is really, really fun and definitely worth checking out. Enhancement is very fun to play and deals solid damage. They're just not going to be one of the super meta specs. Then we get to Restoration Shaman. Restoration Shaman would have been in the Oh God Y tier recently. They're able to heal through everything. Every single healer is able to heal through everything. But Elemental Shaman did absolutely pitiful damage until very recently. They got a flat 20% damage buff on literally all of their abilities that deal damage. And that brings them into the weak tier, I would say. They're just not doing enough throughput compared to the other healers that they're ever going to be considered. But they're certainly not going to slow down your key by too much. They'll be able to heal everything and deal a very small amount of damage. But at the end of the day, damage is what makes a key go faster. And if you're not able to deal damage, you're just not going to be very good in Mythic Plus. So next on the list, we have Windwalker Monk. Windwalker Monk is another DPS spec that is absolutely dealing a billion damage right now. Benjamin. If you made it this far into the video, I brought some surprise guests on to help finish off the tier list. We have.
I have no part of this.
Yeah, well, you're in the video, so too bad. But all right, so now we have Windwalker Monk. So Windwalker Monk is the other DPS spec that's just incredibly strong right now. They've historically been very, very good in Mythic Plus with the way they do their AoE damage, and right now they're just absolutely blasting. I'm going to put them in Fodom tier. I think they're very likely to be strong. They have pretty good utility with both Ring of Peace and Lake Sweep, and they're just overall very, very strong. Any thoughts?
Now put him in F tier. Don't get him nerfed. I want to play it.
All right, sucks for you,
Uh,
bud.
if I'm playing it, S. If THV is playing it, F.
All right. So next we have Mistweaver. Mistweaver has the trouble of being a melee healer, which sucks a little bit for mechanics, but if you're able to survive the fights, they do decent damage right now, and they also do a lot of passive damage because they're fist weaving for their healing. Their throughput's totally fine. You'll be able to survive every fight, but they're just falling behind in damage. They really can't compete with the PI healers, as well as Evoker and Resto Druid right now are just out damaging them, so I'm going to put them in average.
Bitch, did you just call us PI healers?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big
It's
part of why
crazy,
they're
man.
good. All right.
Is that
I'm
the only
never
reason why I'm in the
PIing you.
raid?
It's true, dude. That's why they're good. All right.
It's the
Next
only
we
reason why
have
I'm in the raid.
what? Oh yeah,
What?
true. Yeah, exactly true. All right. Next we have Brewmaster Monk. Brewmaster Monk is unfortunately hit very hard by the 40% damage and health change. They really don't do enough self healing to sustain themselves right now, and it actually puts them behind every single other tank in the roster. Their damage output's absolutely absurd, and as long as they get healed, they are able to survive. So they're not bad by any means, but I just don't think unless they get buffs, they have a chance of being fought at all. I'm going to put them in average tier as well. Next on the list, we have Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin is pretty decent. They don't have Ashen Hollow anymore, which was really what carried them through the first two seasons of Shadowlands. They have very solid throughput. They have very solid passive damage, but they're just not competing with the other healers in terms of raw output for damage or healing. I'm going to put them in the average tier. They're definitely very good, though. They're not weak by any means. Next on the list, we have Prot Paladin. Prot Paladin, again, is the other tank that got hit pretty hard by the 40% health and damage nerf. Their healing is just enough to sustain themselves now. They lost some holy power throughput because they no longer have Avenger Shield giving holy power. They're just not as good as they used to be. Honestly, I think you could consider putting Prot Paladin in weak. I think they probably are the worst tank right now. Since Guardian Druid got 50% nerfs across the board and makes them a lot stronger, I'm going to put Prot Paladin in the weak tier. They're kind of just not doing great. Next, we have Ret Paladin. Ret Paladin's actually slamming DPS right now. They have the problem of being the squishiest class in the game, which is going to make surviving very, very, very hard. But if they're able to survive, they're going to deal good damage. So honestly, I think I could put them in the very strong tier. What do you guys think?
They haven't gotten any nerfs recently, have they?
No, and they deal like really solid damage. They're just gonna die to everything. Is the problem?
They're still kind of a meme. Fuck them. F tier.
Probably like average. Oh God, why? Because fuck the Red Paladins.
Yeah, pretty much.
All right, we'll put them
Just
in
make
the.
it its own tier, like garbage
Well,
at the
I mean, I
bottom.
have Sub Rogue in there because I don't really know much about them. So who
They're not
destroyed
outlaws,
votes?
so they're
Okay.
shit.
All right, next we have Aflock. Aflock is incredibly overtuned right now. They are one of the best single target classes in the game, and their AoE damage is nothing to scoff at. But I think they're overshined by a different Warlock spec, so I'm going to put them in the very strong tier. Completely unkillable class. Dark Pact is the most overpowered button in the game. In addition to that, they have two other very strong defensives that make absolutely no sense. Warlock is just a blessed class. And then we have Demo Lock, which is the last spec I'm going to be putting in the bottom tier for DPS. Demo Lock is just dealing an absolute fuck ton of damage right now. Their implosions are gigantic. They're unkillable. I actually think Affliction Lock or Demolition Lock, it could switch which of those is in the bottom tier. I'm just going to go with Demo Lock for now, based on my opinion. But I think they'll very likely be a Warlock spec.
Did you just call it Demolition Lock?
Shut up.
Demolition Lock.
Demonology Lock. Okay. Uh, Demolition Lock is actually Destruction Warlock, though, who is down bad as fuck. Blizzard realized that making them overpowered for the entire last half of Shadowlands was a mistake, and they nerfed them into the fucking ground. The spec is very down bad right now. I honestly think I could put them in the Oh God Y tier just because, like, compared to what they were in Shadowlands, oh God, what did they do to this spec? You agree?
Yeah, fuck that class.
Yeah, Af's kind of not. If you are a Warlock player, I would not play Destro. I would switch to any of the other two specs because they are both way, way stronger. Next up, we have the Warrior specs. I think historically, Arms Warriors struggled in M+. They're kind of a two-target spec and a single-target monster, whereas Fury is more of the AoE side of Warrior. They're definitely doing fine, though. They're dealing solid damage. I'm going to put them in the average tier. Rallying Cry is decent for your group. Battle Shout's decent if your group has heavy melee, and with Windwalker Monk and Outlaw Rogue being so strong, I think the triple melee meme comp could actually be something reasonable, but Warriors also struggled with the lack of M+ utility. They have a really bad fear and a single target stun, and that's really all they can offer. You can pick up Shockwave in your tree now, but it's kind of hard to get to, and you have to give up some throughput for it. So I really just don't think Arms Warrior is going to be anything special. And then we have Fury Warrior. I think Fury Warrior is kind of just a better version of Arms Warrior in Mythic Plus. They have more consistent cleave on higher target counts, but they're very cooldown reliant now. They got additional cooldowns built into their kit with the Legion abilities coming back. And they're dealing decent damage right now, but it's nothing amazing. And the complete lack of useful M+ utility on Warrior really just holds them back quite a bit. And then, last but not least, we have Prot Warrior. Prot Warrior is another story completely. Prot Warrior is another story. They can actually pick up Shockwave in their tree. They have really good CC. They are completely unkillable. They have the highest physical damage mitigation by far. They have a ton of leech built into their kit, and because they're dealing so much damage now, and they gain more rage and higher target counts with the way their bleeds work, Prot Warrior is going to be outputting a ton of damage and be completely unkillable in Mythic Plus. I think it's going to be the go-to tank in Mythic Plus in Dragonflight. I think the highest possible keys, you might use a different tank that has potentially higher damage output, especially with a raid buff like Chaos Brand that's offered from Demon Hunter. But I really think Prot Warrior is going to be back at the BFA levels of absurd power and just pumping out damage and being completely unkillable. They have a very strong chance of being fought, in my opinion. All right, and then Raji, you're doing the outro for the video.
Oh, am I now?
Yeah, you are.
If you're subscribed, unsubscribe, and block this channel.
I don't think you can block people on YouTube.
Well, I would, look into it, see if it's possible. If not, I don't know.
All right, well,
just avoid it.
If you made it this far into the video, congratulations. You heard a message from our Lord the Stoat. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.